welcome everybody. We've still got lots of people coming into the audience, but welcome to our industry leaders here today. I'll just kick off, and I think I just want to ask you all a sort of a generalised question based on your backgrounds. Richard, we were talking earlier about the fact that you've all worked extensively overseas. So in our research on patient rights and roles, we've been trying to understand how patients are viewed across the world and how they interact with government and industry. And it'd be interesting to see from your perspective what the differences are compared to Australia. I know, Biljana, that you and Stuart both worked in Europe. Neil and Jamie, you're more recently in Japan, Singapore and Korea. Michael, responsibility in, you've had Africa and the Middle East, which would be fascinating. And Liz, you're also in the Asia Pac region in Japan and Singapore, Korea. So if you could just, I could start by asking you all just to briefly comment on the state of patient rights in those countries, and upon reflection, how does that really compare to the experience in Australia? And perhaps I'll start with you, Michael, because you're in my up left corner.
Great. It's great to be here with you, Amanda, and everybody else. Look, yes, in terms of South Africa and the Middle East, the experience is very different in terms of patient rights. So I'd say on the outset, they're fairly limited in those environments. And a part of that is due to the healthcare system. So in most of the markets that I did operate in or oversaw, we didn't really have national reimbursement systems. So some were based on health insurance models, some were based on a private pay model. So relative to Australia, that was a clear difference. And as a consequence of that, the voice of the patient and patient rights differed greatly compared to what we see here in Australia. You know, coming under a national reimbursement system, and where there are opportunities and more sophisticated patient advocacy groups like yourselves set up, I find that the voice and the rights of patients in Australia is quite different, and it's certainly more amplified.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I might come back to you soon and ask you to expand a little bit on that too. It's very interesting. Neil?
So yeah, I've had the opportunity to work in Africa too, as well as Asia Pac and Australia. So I think maybe just building on Michael's on the African experience, just significantly more limited in the opportunities, but still with the same passion and aspiration. I think that's a critical perspective that links all of the countries. If you compare that into, you know, for example, experiences in Japan, where products after regulatory approval are instantly on the approval to all 90 days by almost, you know, legislative council almost, it changes the challenges of each patient. What I would say around patient groups is patient groups continue in every one of the countries I've worked in to play a critical role in elevating awareness, number one, and then two, making people understand what they're entitled to. What are their rights and entitlements? And I think that just differs in the maturity, and as Michael says, based on the actual infrastructure of how healthcare is delivered in each country.
Stuart, would you like to expand on that based on your experience overseas?
Thank you. Yeah, no, nice to be here. I've worked in 6 countries, actually all of them publicly funded healthcare systems, which is quite interesting. But probably the least developed was in Hungary when I was living and working in Budapest, and it was really shocking. And maybe an element we haven't talked about is what's the physician and patient relationship. And in both Hungary and in Portugal, actually, it was very much adult to child. It was not a peer-to-peer relationship, which I found, you know, coming from New Zealand, to be quite distressing. To Neil's point, so I think, you know, if we're really striving for patient-centered care, which is all around collaboration and shared decision-making, operating in those kinds of models can be quite challenging. Patient groups are extremely important, but unfortunately, in countries like Hungary, very, very underdeveloped and really lacking some even basic skills. So I'm loving being in Australia when we can get to work with extraordinary patient groups and like Rare Cancers Australia. But so I would say Australia is doing well.
Yeah, so you think those interactions are much better between clinicians and patients in Australia?
I would certainly hope so. I would certainly hope so.
Jamie, what has your experience been like?
So I've worked in 2 geographies across the Asia Pacific in a really broad range of countries, from very underdeveloped countries such as Indonesia to, you know, South Korea, probably at the other end of the spectrum, where they're very developed healthcare systems, and also in Europe, but that was some time ago in the UK. And I guess what stands out for me, Amanda, when I'm thinking about this is that I think what the others have said is right. There's a lot of passion in patient groups. What stands Australia apart for me is that passion needs to be organised, and it needs to be directed in a way that can have impact. Whilst all passionate patient groups can support patients, I think we're looking really ideally for more than that. We're looking for patients to have a voice, a seat at the table, help us shape policy, and that requires groups like Rare Cancers and initiatives like Patient Voice Initiative to make sure that that passion is directed in a way that has impact beyond just supporting patients that are also experiencing those health conditions. Not that that's not important, but in terms of shaping the environment moving forward, I think it's really critical to have groups that are savvy as to how the system works and how influence can happen inside those systems. And this is where I see Australia as much further ahead, and I think it is really groups like Rare Cancers that have spearheaded that to a great extent. One of the things I would add to that is that when I worked in the UK, it was a long time ago now actually, and equity of access was already a theme then, and I think that's really starting to be talked about a lot more now in Australia and other countries. But perhaps from that perspective, maybe we are still catching up when we're talking to policymakers about equitable care. That's probably still something that we've got to work a bit further on in Australia, but I think we've got all of the ingredients to continue to shape policy in this space.
Thanks, Jamie. And just to expand on that a little bit, do you think that patient organisations are the vehicle for patients, or is there an opportunity for patients to sort of engage directly in an organised way?
Maybe I see patients engaging directly in an organised way as patient groups. Maybe, Amanda, maybe I'm not making enough distinction between them in my own mind. I think there is power in numbers and power in organisation, and what a group like Rare Cancers brings is that single-minded focus to represent the patient voice. And I think that is really critical to get a seat at the table when you're thinking about government and policy, Department of Health. I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, certainly helps when driving change, and that's what we saw last year. Liz?
Yeah, I mean, some great points made by Jamie, and it's wonderful to be here. What an illustrious group of peers, and it's really, really wonderful to be connected with an organisation that wants to raise the voice of patients. So I would just talk about my experience in South Korea, and I was there for 4 years, and there is no doubt that patients with cancer in South Korea feel the need for their voice to be heard exactly the same as patients in Australia. That there's the same level of passion and need is there. But actually, there was a group started when I was there called the Korean Cancer Care Alliance, and actually it was modelled on the Cancer Care Alliance that was done here in Australia. So I wanted to add, and John Zaltzberg, I think, who's on the call, was part of that. And Korea learned from Australia the benefit of having an organised voice and actually tried to model that. So there was a collaboration between the industry, between specialists, the Korean version of John Zaltzberg, etc., and the patient organisations. And what they did was collected evidence, went out to patients, collected a set of data, and governments really listen to evidence, and that really helped raise the voice, which is patients really care. They want the best treatment. They can't afford it. They want the government to really listen and get better access. So I think that was a real start in South Korea, where in the past patients used to stand outside the Ministry of Health with banners waving and crying, where the government officials would just walk past them. But this Cancer Care Alliance really started to have some leverage. So I think what Richard is doing, not only with Australia, but is actually helping share some of those learnings across other countries, the benefit of having an organised voice, a well-articulated evidence-based voice, And I think that's something other countries are benefiting from as well.
Oh, thanks, Liz. And that's referring to the Pinnacle program that the team are working on, to reach the Asia Pac region. So a lot of exciting work there too. Biljana, can you talk a little bit about your experience overseas?
Certainly, it's great to be here with everybody. A lot of great things have been said already. I can maybe continue building on what Liz has started. In every country, and I worked in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia Pac. In every country, patient organizations are in different levels of organizing themselves. On one side, from that cry to be physically organized, which we already have, to that once you're organized, what do you do with that? And how do you build the voice at the table where it matters? Because the patient needs are going to be many. And sometimes we have these expectations of patient organizations to solve all the issues that patients might have that not necessarily sit in the realm of what a patient organization should do. There are two huge aspects where I've seen it work really fantastically. On one side is educating the public on the need for in a singular therapeutic area on what the issues are, and valuing a broader support to changing them for the benefit of patients holistically. And then on the other side, shaping the policies, because in the majority of the markets, certainly in Australia, where you have a singular payer, influencing how the cost of therapy is seen or how a disease management is done is a very broad process that needs to incorporate a lot of things. And unless a patient organization or a collection of patient organizations is clear in what are the things they want to change one by one and not going everywhere, it is harder to make an impact with any government.
Yeah, thanks. So I think just from that, there's a lot of themes from your perspective from industry that for patients to have sort of an impact, we need to be organised and come together with a sort of united voice or united asks and positions. I just ask whoever's got there in the audience who's not on mute, could go on mute, please. So I just wanted to direct a question to you, Liz. So last week we had the clinician panel, and we've heard very clearly that information is really important from a patient perspective. And I know industry does a lot of work to try and provide information in different forms that's easily, digestible from a patient perspective. But when we talk about transparency as a patient right, I think there are key learnings from the recent confusion or distortion of information with the COVID rollout and the side effects. And I was just wondering if you could touch on that, Liz, and just talk about, from your perspective, is there an opportunity to expand sort of the transparency of information so that patients get the full story and not sort of a distorted view of the evidence?
So thanks for the very easy question, Amanda, that you've thrown at me. But I think it's a really, really important one. I've been reflecting as an industry, probably in the past, we were very cautious about communicating directly with patients. We knew that we'd had conditions around it. There were regulations. We needed to be really careful with being able to explain information in a balanced way. And we still have a regulation around not being able to promote directly to patients. But I think we've grown over the past few years to be more comfortable and better equipped to be able to communicate to patients in a more organised way. Of course, we need to do that through experts. It's really not our role to provide medical advice or expert advice. But we've actually worked really hard over the past few months to ensure that the experts have the right information. Unfortunately, we've had a bit of battle where we've had a lot of media reports, and those are really, really difficult to control. But I would say now across our companies, we have people that are better trained, are more organised, and know how to communicate with patients and using the lines into the physicians. And we really believe it is our role that patients have a right for information. Patients have a right to choose the best treatment option for them. And how to do that is to have information that they can understand and make their own choices. So I think, this is a really important area for us as an industry, and one that we want to step forward on, so that patients are able to have their full right, which is the right of choice.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Jamie, I might just switch to you and ask you a direct question towards you. Just touching on and expanding on what you talked about before about being organised and the patient voice sort of coming together, it might be interesting for the audience to also get an understanding of patient advisory boards and how do patients get a role on a patient advisory board, and how does industry use patient advisory boards?
Thanks, Amanda. Look, I think this is a great question, and there's always opportunities for industry to work more closely with patients. I think there's always a role for us to do better in this space, but I'm really pleased to say I think we've come a long way, even more recently, in making sure patients are engaged as we go through the drug development process. For a company like Gilead, we have a global patient engagement team, and there's certainly they're really focused on elevating the patient voice throughout drug development. And so those are often run from a global perspective, but we also do engage with patients here locally as well on patient advisory boards, often through groups such, again, as Rare Cancers and other organised patient groups that help us to identify patients who are really passionate and knowledgeable and able to speak on behalf of other patients in a way that can help us to understand where we can add more value to the patients as they are being treated with our medicines, but also experiencing the diseases that we are really dedicated to working on. So I think, once again, this is where patients who have a passion in this space should be really looking out for patient initiatives like the Patient Voice Initiative and joining groups like Rare Cancers and making sure their voice is heard to make sure those opportunities are available. And I think there's a role really there. For me, the most important role that patients can play, or one of the most important roles, is helping us to really understand value in the medicines that we develop. So this is the idea that we design clinical trials, but they don't always recognise what patients see as great breakthroughs or great progress when it comes to their treatment. And I think we have to be listening better to make sure, yes, our clinical trials meet the endpoints that they're designed to meet to get us through a regulatory and reimbursement process. But as the regulators and payers get better at listening to patients too, hopefully this will mean we develop medicines that more holistically address the concerns of patients as they're fighting diseases that we're all dedicated to addressing. So I think there's a lot more room for improvement. We've come a long way and a lot still to do.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I just wanted to touch a little bit on what you said about sort of patient preferences. And I think that's great. There are a lot of tools to capture patient preferences that are being developed, but I'll just direct the next question to you, Stuart. Do you think that there's a more formal role that could be played in the incorporation of, patient preferences into decision making around, access that could sort of ease the burden of access so that patients can get treatments faster?
When you mean access, Amanda, do you mean access to clinical trials, or do you mean like reimbursement? What?
Reimbursement. So thinking about incorporating patient preferences and patient reported outcomes or patient reported experiences into clinical trials that could then be formally assessed and included in the value proposition, or the way that the authorities look at the value measures.
No, completely agree, because I think we all understand and we often know that many of the medicines we produce, yes, they have a very clear clinical benefit, but there are often what we call secondary effects. They have huge impacts on quality of life. They have impacts, for example, on how the family might be operating. It may have an opportunity that somebody who's been a carer actually no longer needs to be a carer, can go back and start paying taxes again. Unfortunately, not all of these parameters are taken into account by our paying systems, but we strongly believe that these are really important considerations that are critical to actually evaluating the value that a medicine can have. And we'd welcome that opportunity. Indeed, we did a study recently, not in the oncology area, but in another area, and the secondary effects, they are often called, were quite extraordinary. And although they might not be formally recognized, we certainly hope that when stakeholders are looking at reimbursement and evaluating its potential value, that they would take that into account. But yeah, no, very, very much supportive.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. And did you want to say something, Liz?
Yeah, I was just going to. Sorry, you're doing this so organised, but you know, I just wanted to jump in on what Stuart was saying. I think the tide is turning on this, actually. I mean, with the House of Reps inquiry, the noise is more like a crescendo, isn't it?
Yes.
That you know, you can hear it across Australia. That patient benefits, patient outcomes are really critical now to be included in a formal way in the evaluation process. And I think, look, I'm really optimistic about it. I'm a bit more of a glass half full person, but I think the government is really keen to do that as well. Neil's probably got more experience from his recent pilot he wants to talk to, but they don't really know how, right? I mean, there are other examples around the world of how a patient voice and patient input is more formalised into the process. But I think that the government is going to be open to that, and the louder the patient organisation together with industry can promote that message, then I think there will be a way that these can be recognised in the future, and that our committees that are commissioned to make these decisions on behalf of the government can start to evaluate more broadly the benefits of new treatment. So I really think that we're on the tip of an
now is the time, isn't it? It's just come to this sort of sticky point where they can't sort of ignore it anymore. Neil, did you want to touch on how BMS has been really supportive of incorporating the patient voice and patient preferences?
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thanks, Amanda. I think there's two different pieces I guess I would go to here. The first piece is it's not just in the reimbursement environment, as Stuart clarified. Actually, multinational companies are embedding patient needs and assessments right back into the development committees, right back at headquarters, so outside of Australia. And they are really looking at what are the key index about what makes a difference to patients' lives. So intrinsically, baking them into how we go about, researching our science and then obviously getting it reimbursed into a country. So that's the first piece. And more recently, so we had Samit Hirawa, our head of R&D globally, have some time with 30 patient groups here in Australia earlier this year. So that's an important perspective. And I know that many of us do similar activities. I think as it comes to, let's say, Australia's reimbursement perspective, we, as Liz said, we did a pilot recently with the Patient Voice Initiative about how can you take a very simple template under the HTA international protocols and really provide the information that allows patients to take part in the HTA process, increase the awareness of what is the science, how is it going to impact your life, and not give chapter and verse and detailed protocols and study designs, etc. That's our job as the multinational company to deal with that complexity, but really allow patients to take point about what matters to them in their lives, their families' lives, because cancer is a devastating disease, not just obviously for the patient, but for the wider community and family too. So I think we've seen some step forward. I think I agree with Liz, and when we say that this is something we need to push forward with. The House of Reps gives us further opportunities. And I think that this is something that as a collegiate group where I think in this space, more unites us than differs us. And I think we really need to kind of push forward and work together about how we can continue to put the Australian patient at the forefront. So super excited by this, but obviously there's always much, much more to do.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And just for the audience members out there who might not know, we're talking about the recent Senate inquiry into access to medicines. I just wanted to ask you, Biljana, just to touch on that, and I don't want to sort of shift this into a conversation about HTA, but I can't help myself to ask this question. Do you think that what Neil's talking about is enough to accelerate access? I know I got a sense that there are some frustrations from your side, having had a global experience with sort of the government's willingness to pay, and that might be around our sort of value assessment process that heavily relies on this sort of HTA model. Do we need to do more? Do we need to step away and reform our system so patients have fast access and they don't have to pay themselves for therapies?
So look, that's a wonderful question. I guess continuation of what Liz and Neil have been saying already. I think the moment is there because of everything that has been opened, and I guess the heightened lens on healthcare we have been living through past year and a half. HTA systems they exist in very few countries in the world. And even in the countries where they exist, they have been reformed to meet the needs of the present changes that happen in healthcare. Our HTA system has been very rigid past 30 years. And if we don't start incorporating these things that are more understanding of how do you put value behind innovation, what do you compare it to? How do you add patient voice in, and how do you add PROs, and why do they matter, and what matters? And how do you connect various parts of the government investment? And I'm saying investment very intentionally because healthcare is an investment, it's not a cost. You will not see the benefits of those investments if you don't look at your budget holistically. One of the things that is in HTA countries, patient voices are harder to get through. So they are getting through in UK. They are getting through a little bit in Canada as well. This is a beautiful example through this panel and the work that Rare Cancers have been doing and the NOA have been doing. But countries like, for example, Germany, where you don't have an HTA, but you have a public system, patient voice is included in the pre-submission work. And the work that our company has done with the German reimbursement authority is to actually pre-submission and pre-design of the phase 3 trial actually get feedback on, are these patient-reported outcomes actually something that is beneficial for the German society? Because they look at it differently. And I think it's a moment where we need to support patient organizations, support citizens of Australia to ask for a meaningful reform of an HTA that is going to enable incorporation of a patient voice, because currently in the system that we have, you can raise your voice even if you're at the table, and it can be left in vain because you don't have process to take what matters to patients into account.
Thanks, Biljana. That was really eloquently said, and appreciate the sentiments there around the investment rather than the costs of medicines, and investing in someone's health to, particularly in cancer, to prolong survival. How do you measure the value of that? Michael, I'm going to shift gears. I could really delve right into that, Biljana, but there's so many questions. So I'm going to shift gears, Michael, and ask you a question that, the audience are sometimes wondering. When bringing new therapies to Australia, from overseas, what are the main considerations, and why are therapies trialled in some cancers and not others?
Yeah, so I think it's firstly, we all know we're operating within a global ecosystem now. I don't think there's any question about that. I think as we start to think, first of all, when it comes to clinical trials, it's about ensuring, first of all, the patient populations do exist where the trials need to be conducted, that you've got good quality investigators, that the trials can be conducted with the highest standards. And on all of those measures, Australia really punches well above its weight. So as I look across my peers on the call, we all have in excess of hundreds of trials between us that are ongoing in Australia. But some of the things that our corporate officers also look at is, well, what will happen at the conclusion of that trial as well? So what's the likelihood of broad access and reimbursement? Because it's one thing to conduct the study and to get the data. What we're all about on this call is ensuring the widest possible access in the shortest possible period of time. And it's a competitive process. So all of our countries actually compete against each other for clinical trial investment, because it is a finite pool of money that gets allocated to research. It's a huge amount of investment that the industry puts in with a huge amount of risk, but it's also a very competitive process. And I certainly feel Australia does punch above its weight. At least in our organisation, I can share that Australia actually ranks in the top 5 globally. So if you think about that relative to our size, that's a terrific outcome. But the other area where we tend to lag, and that we do get questioned on, is, well, your time to access. So you've got the great clinical trial infrastructure, you get your medicines registered very quickly, but it's taking 400, 600, 800 days post-registration, when we see in other markets, as my colleagues have shared, in some areas that's 50 days post-registration. The average tends to be 150, 200. And so I think for us, together with the patients, it's how do we ensure we can bridge that gap. So from the moment of a clinical trial to registration, a product's registered, Australians have broad access within 90 days. And I think that's really achievable, Amanda. If our HTA system is reformed, as Biljana and Jamie and others have spoken to, now's the time to do it. We have a terrific opportunity with the NMP, National Medicines Policy Review, that's also about to take place. And at the end of the day, patients are taxpayers. Patients are constituents. And I think the voice around that, and especially being as well informed as possible to demand, right? When we talk about rights, it's a patient right to be able to have broad access in under 100 days from registration. We see it happening in other countries. There's no reason why it shouldn't be happening in Australia.
Thanks, Michael. That was, again, also really well said around patients being taxpayers and taking that right back to patient rights. So thanks for that. I think, just touching on what you said, what our patients have articulated to us, and our patient support team sort of deal with this every day, is that patients are having to finance their own treatments. And there's two sides of that. On one side of the coin, they're either having to finance their own treatments because the system is just taking too long, or because they need to find clinical trials, and clinical trials are becoming sort of the next treatment option, rather than sort of merely just being the proof of value, if you like, for the new therapy. So with clinical trials being the new treatment option, is there a way that the trial criteria, the inclusion criteria, can be expanded so that more people can access a particular therapy at the same time as using that trial for evidence purposes to support reimbursement or registration?
Maybe I can have a go. Well, Michael, sorry, you go.
Yep. So look, I was going to say, to start with, I think we all recognise the burden that purchasing innovation can be, and it should not be the case for patients, especially in a country like Australia, where we are a top OECD country. We are fortunate with a great system, and we are a very wealthy nation. And it's incumbent upon our government to ensure that that wealth is distributed in the right way to us all. And I think access, it has to be universal. And I don't feel that clinical trials are the right avenue versus a broad access system. And I do feel the clinical trials have their purpose, which is to demonstrate the safety and the efficacy of the innovation, the medicine that's being trialled. Again, as I said earlier, it is a very competitive process. We do have a fixed pool in terms of patient allocations. Everybody on this call does their best to ensure we get clinical trials to Australia as quickly as possible. So we do have that access. But at the end of the day, I think our efforts should be behind closing that gap from registration to reimbursement. Otherwise, all we're trying to do is find a short stop method, and that's not what any of us is about. It's not what gets all of us up in the morning. It's about that broad, equitable access, and it's the shortest time frame as possible. Sorry, Stuart.
No, it's fine. And just building on that. But I believe very strongly that if you're going to have a shared decision making in every conversation about patient treatment and patient pathways, clinical trials should be part of that conversation. So you have options available to you. Is it a funded, treatment provided by the government, or is maybe for your individual circumstance a clinical trial an alternative? It is a standard of care, and we work, as Michael said, very hard to bring them. Now, to your specific question about entry criteria, I think it's a polarity. It's something that we have to manage. In order to get a medicine registered and to get it registered quickly and available quickly, we do have to have criteria. But very often, as pharmaceutical companies, we are running parallel studies. They're often called phase 3B, or immediately post-registration, once you've achieved it, we might offer a phase 4, where really the entry criteria will be much broader. And the primary objective is to collect broader safety data, which is always very, very useful to have. So we're very cognizant of it, but it's a balance that we have to strike of getting quality data to get that medicine registered so it can get into the public system as quickly as possible. But to your point, Amanda, how do we also make sure that other patients who might not quite fit also get access? Neil.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that one, I think Sharon made the point in the chat here. Clinical trials provide that optionality for that patient who is in need at that point in time, but the trial will eventually close, and we need to provide sustainable access. So as Michael says, that broad, equitable access that's sustainable for Australian patients is the piece we seek. In the interim, of course, as Stuart says, optionality, providing a range of opportunities for patients who are at a point of need right now. Absolutely, we need to do that, but that shouldn't distract us from the main game, and the main game is broad, equitable, early access. And as Australians, as a rich country, as Michael says, why should we accept anything less? And I guess that's the question where, asking the direct question is, as taxpayers in a taxpayer-funded scheme, how can we make those changes? And that comes back to the first question around patient groups, about where are the points of influence and how can we energise ourselves to make those differences that generates that sustainable healthcare future for Australia. Because there's many things that we get right. There are many things in Australia we get right. It's just how can we continue to evolve and improve as our science has over time. Liz?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we're being very polite, putting our hands up, and well chaired, Amanda. I was just going to add to the points that have been made, and probably just to reflect, it may not be as easy as it sounds, but we certainly need to do it, because clearly we have a system that's been in place for almost 30 years. There are some statutory elements around it, so our PBAC are required to do their job according to their terms of reference, right? So we really have to be absolutely diligent, resilient to get through a review of those processes and out the other side, so that the system is future fit for the next 10, 20 years, because changing it it's not like you just write it on one pager and it's done. So probably just to share that with the patients and patient groups on the call, but we really need a united voice here. Just to talk a bit about where that has happened, I think, is across in the TGA arena, registration, where products are evaluated for approval. There's certainly been efforts that have been made over the past 5 years or so to speed up that process, and I think the TGA have really actually spearheaded that. Where we've got things like the priority review process now, where products that are with early data can be approved within really short periods of time. We've got the conditional approval, which is now many products are now getting approved under that. And we've got regulatory harmonisation, where the TGA works with the US FDA or works with Canada or with other regulatory authorities to speed up the sharing of those assessment processes. So those kind of things are actually happening in Australia, and it's meaning that products are being approved earlier. However, that sometimes then lengthens the time even more between approval and reimbursement. So, just to underline the importance of system change, clarity on what needs to be changed, but the fact that we have to go through the process to achieve it.
Yeah, and Jamie, I'll ask you to comment on that because you've got your hand up, and then I just want to let the panel know we've only got 15 minutes left, so I've got questions coming in blowing my mind on the side here. So Jamie, go ahead, and then I'll try and direct some of these questions to you, because otherwise I'll have some very frustrated audience members out there.
I'll be very brief. This is obviously a passionate topic for this group of panelists, and I know why. I guess I couldn't agree more with what's been said. We should not look to clinical trials or compassionate use to replace a long, slow HTA process. That's absolutely what it is. And I think for me also, it's one step further than that. I think we have to continually be questioning whether the HTA process, and as has been pointed out by Neil and Michael, we are taxpayers that are very much part of this process. Does it reflect our societal expectations? And so there's been some really interesting data around that there's not necessarily a PBAC funding decision is not necessarily more likely in an area where there's higher unmet need. So if there's less treatments available, doesn't mean we're likely to get a positive outcome. But we know that a more serious disease is a predictor for a positive outcome from PBAC. So there's some fundamental principles here that we have to start asking ourselves as the lucky recipients of a universal healthcare system where we do have broad access generally to treatments, around what do we believe in the debate between equality and equity, where does Australia stand on this, and how do we represent that in the decisions that are made around medicines funding? And I think that's a critical place for patient voice, because that is really not, it's a complex question, not a simple answer, and we need to have a really robust debate about that, and it has to be reflected in policy as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And I think, you know, that's why as this organisation, we're trying to take it back to a conversation about, you know, human rights and what do we value as a society. And if one of those things is to have, you know, fast access to up and coming treatments in a way that patients can afford, then, you know, it then takes the conversation, removes it from sort of picking apart the bits of the system that don't work and just thinking, well, we need to find a solution here because we're all in agreement. I might, with Biljana, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to direct a question here to you from Todd. Would the panel see having the patient voice formally incorporated into the regulatory and the HTA process as a fundamental human right?
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Todd, for the question. Yes, I think that is a fundamental human right, and it's a part of being part of the process or a solution to the process. Now, you need to enable that. Now what we can do before we do together the reform of the healthcare system is organize the inputs from the patient organizations as part of our value submissions, or as part of the things that we do jointly with the TGA or the PBAC. So that input that a patient would give, where there is a balance, like Jamie said, between equity and equality, where there's a balance of understanding of what is the solution in this segment of therapy mean for me, for my caregivers, for my family, for my contribution to society. If we put it holistically in that way, I think that matters a lot. One of the things that we as a company have done, because we are also somewhat in rare diseases, apart from cancers, which is in pulmonary artery hypertension, we created together with all patient organizations and physician societies a PAH, so pulmonary artery hypertension patient charter, that talks about holistic approach to the patients and patient management, which goes where therapy comes last, but education, appropriate diagnosis, equitable treatment, right for information, care, all of other things that are fundamental to get it right for the patient are part of that dialogue. So individually and as companies and as clusters of companies, like Neil said, this is our unifying theme. We all want the best for the patients in Australia. We can do a lot, but this will be like having clinical trials instead of broad access. It's going to put some fires out and help certain patient populations, but unless we approach it in a system change way where we have a patient voice that is fundamentally included as a must, and then we know, so what does happen after you have a voice? Rare Cancers of Australia have a voice in PBAC. What does that mean? What does great look like when you raise your voice? These are the things that we have to reimagine together, and I think that next year and maybe next few years are going to be the platform for us to create that.
Let's hope so. So if I'm going to ask one more question of each of you, and I think we've probably only got 1 minute for you all to answer it, so I'll try and say it very quickly. What are the things that is, again, that I touched on before, that's very debilitating for patients is the shift in their financial circumstances and the fact that they are having to self-fund treatments more readily. Our health system relies on multinational corporations such as the ones you work for to interface with a sort of a single payer nation. So I've only got one payer here realistically. What is our biggest and most immediate risk, and what can patients do about it? I'll start with you, Michael. We'll just try and keep it to 1 minute.
To clarify, saying the risk with our system, is that right, Amanda? Just to clarify.
What's the risk that we've only got one payer? I guess the problem is, as we know, if it's not funded by the government, then it's not funded at all, and patients might have to travel overseas, or if it's not funded in enough time, then patients have to travel overseas, or there's no other option. So, what is the risk if we don't address this problem, and what can patients do about it today?
Well, I think the risk is inequitable access. That's the fundamental risk that we have, right? I think there's huge pluses in terms of having a single payer. It can bring very broad and rapid access if it appropriately values what innovations can bring. But I feel the biggest risk is you end up with inequitable access, which is what none of us want to see. I saw in the chat there was a comment there about access is a right? It's a fundamental right. And that, to me, is the biggest risk that we currently have with our system, is if we can't provide that rapid access within 90 days post-registration, we're going to end up in a 2-tier system or a 3-tier system, and that's not what anybody wants to see happen.
Neil?
I agree with Michael's answer. I'm going to supplement a little bit. I think if the science, which is our underlying core competency as a company, is moving faster than it's ever moved in the past. If the system doesn't change, then what you'll see, as Michael says, not only will you see inequitable access, you won't see access at all to some of the true innovations that's providing, into maintenance therapy, or in some cases into cure therapy. And I think that if we truly want to kind of put, the rights of Australian patients at the heart of this, we have to continue to follow. We have to continue to make an investment window available where Australian patients can receive the best healthcare possible. So there's a risk that if we don't change, then the reality science will change faster, and then as such, we'll fall further behind. So that's the risk I see right now.
Stuart?
Yes, as we've said today, health matters, medicines matter, and health, investing in healthcare is not a cost. It's an investment. If we've learned anything about COVID, we see that relationship. Pre-COVID, you'd often hear government talk about the fact, because the economy is strong, we can invest in healthcare. I think it also goes the other way. If you don't have a healthy population, you're not going to have a strong economy, and COVID is showing that. So it's realizing that the two are intimate, absolutely intertwined, and investing in health is the right thing to do, because it's a human right, but it's also good for the economy, good for the country, and good for patients.
Ileana, what can we do to drive the change forward?
So beautifully said by Neil and Michael and Stuart so far. I just want to go back to the people here who are listening to us discussing this passionately. And I have to say, you have the power. You have the power to consolidate your voices and raise them through Rare Cancers or NOA or any other patient organization, and make sure that we're banging on the same drum together. Because the ultimate goal for all of us is system enhancement, acknowledging everything great that happens in Australia, but then fitting it for the future, which, like Neil said, is we have not only promises of cure, but there's actually cure being brought to some of the diseases, and we don't have a measurement to value it.
Please.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the others have said, I would absolutely agree with. We do have a risk of falling behind in inequities of access, and I think we have the added issue that we're a relatively small nation. on the global scale. You know, it is what it is. We love living here, but we're relatively small. So I would really endorse what Biljana and the others have said. Patient voice and in an organised way really matters, really makes a difference. I mean, we are advocates on behalf of Australian patients almost every week to our global organisation. Some of you may not know that, but we certainly do that. But the patient voice is the one that matters. And I've heard anecdotally from people sitting on the PBAC, sitting in government, if a patient organisation says something, they really listen. So I'd encourage all the patient organisations on this call to continue speaking out.
And last but not least, Jamie, do you have something to add?
So beautifully said by my colleagues. What more is there to add? I mean, I think the risk is that patients will miss out. And I think we know that patients have missed out. There are patients that have missed out on early access to treatments that are available in other geographies. And I think that incredibly hard for us to hear. And I think all of us in the industry and the patients and the patient groups represented here are fighting very hard to change that. But ultimately, just keeping in mind that we are all going to be patients at some point, and through our life we'll be patients, and we want access to the best possible medicines. They are out there. As Biljana said, there's cures out there. Science is moving so rapidly, as Neil has said. We must keep up. It's an imperative that we keep up and we value medicines appropriately and get them to patients as quickly as possible. We just don't want to be left behind. Australian patients can't be left behind.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to pass to Richard in a second, but I just wanted to touch on what you said, and I think it's really important that we all recognise that, yes, at one point in our lives, or maybe even more points, we're all patients. So we're doing what we do for ourselves and our nation, and thanks everybody from my perspective. And I'm going to pass over to Richard now.